You were never meant to carry the weight of your wounds alone. What if the very pain you're hiding is the doorway through which grace wants to enter? There is a quiet and persistent myth that has settled into the modern soul like dust into the corners of a long-abandoned house, the myth that we are sufficient unto ourselves, that if we just try hard enough, dig deep enough, read the right books, think the right thoughts, and discipline ourselves with enough relentless self-will, we can emerge from the shadows of our suffering unscathed, whole, and radiant. This belief is seductive. It flatters our pride and feeds the illusion that we are the authors of our own salvation. But it is a lie, and nowhere does it reveal its hollowness more profoundly than in the presence of deep, soul-aching pain. Pain is the great disassembler of illusions. It strips away the outer armor of competence, intellect, and poise. It exposes what we would rather keep hidden, our need, our fear, our fragility. Yet, even then, even when the night closes in and the scaffolding of our strength collapses, there is something stubborn in us that resists surrender. We press forward, thinking that we must be the ones to crawl out of the pit, claw our way toward the light, whisper affirmations into the mirror until our soul finally believes what our lips recite. But there are wounds that laugh in the face of affirmation, griefs that are deaf to the sound of motivational speeches. Some pain lives too deep for language. Some brokenness cannot be fixed with formulas or frameworks. The tragedy of self-reliance is not just its failure, it is the cruelty it inflicts along the way. Because when the healing doesn't come, when the darkness doesn't lift, we don't blame the lie of self-sufficiency. We blame ourselves. We think, if I had just been stronger, if I had prayed better, if I hadn't let it get to me, if I had more faith. The cycle becomes vicious. Pain is now accompanied by shame. Suffering turns into self-condemnation. And so we retreat further, isolated not just in our experience, but in our belief that we are uniquely weak for not being able to handle it. There's a peculiar irony here. The more we insist on healing ourselves, the more we seem to bleed. Because the human soul, unlike machines or mathematical equations, is not built for solitary repair. We are relational creatures, formed in the image of a God whose essence is communion, whose very nature is love. To be human is to be dependent, not in a pitiful, clingy way, but in a sacred, soul-deep way. Our need is not a flaw in the design. It is part of the blueprint. We were made to lean, to open, to reach beyond ourselves. And yet, how many of us lie awake at night, suffocating under burdens we were never meant to carry alone? Self-reliance in the realm of deep pain is like trying to heal a stab wound with positive thinking, or mend a shattered bone by pretending it doesn't hurt. It may appear noble, it may even win the applause of a world obsessed with independence, but it is a slow and silent form of self-abandonment. We become our own jailers, locking the very parts of us that cry for help behind walls of pride and pretense. And then we wonder why joy seems distant, why peace feels like a rumor we once believed but no longer trust. What makes this even more tragic is that help stands so near. A divine presence waits patiently, not to lecture or to judge, but to heal. Yet we, in our resolve to be strong, keep the door bolted. We insist that we must get ourselves together before we dare ask for help. But healing doesn't require you to be strong. It requires you to be honest, to say, I cannot fix this, I cannot carry this, I am not enough, and I was never meant to be. Pain, in all its forms, emotional, physical, spiritual, is often the first thing we wish to eliminate when it enters our lives. It intrudes without warning, disrupts our plans, and forces us to feel things we would rather keep buried. Our instinct is to resist it, to numb it, to push it aside, or distract ourselves until it goes away. We label it as the enemy, the thing to conquer or avoid. But pain, as uncomfortable as it is, holds a strange kind of honesty. It tells the truth. It reveals where something has gone wrong, where a wound has formed, where healing is needed. It has no interest in pretenses or masks. Pain does not pretend. It forces us to stop. It asks us to pay attention. It invites us to be still enough to hear what we have long ignored. But instead of listening, we often retreat, not just from the pain itself, but from the people around us, from vulnerability, and sometimes even from God. And that retreat is where the true danger lies. Isolation, not pain, is what erodes the soul. When we begin to believe that our suffering must be borne alone, when we internalize the idea that no one could possibly understand, that our struggles make us weak, that sharing our hurt is a burden to others, we lock ourselves inside a silent prison. The walls of that prison are not made of stone, but of shame, fear, and the lie that our value is tied to our composure. We learn to smile while silently falling apart. We laugh while privately breaking. And all the while, the pain grows heavier, not because it has increased, but because it has lost its witness. The human heart was not made to suffer in silence. From the beginning, we were crafted for connection, for communion. The first crisis in human history was not sin, it was solitude. It is not good for man to be alone is not merely a relational observation, it is a spiritual warning. And when pain enters a life already steeped in isolation, it multiplies, not just in sensation, but in consequence. Pain that is hidden festers. It morphs into despair, depression, disillusionment. It begins to whisper lies in the dark, lies about your worth, your future, your belonging. And because no one is there to contradict those whispers, we start to believe them. There is something profoundly healing about being seen in our suffering. Not fixed, not analyzed, not offered a 10-point plan to recovery, but simply seen. To have someone sit beside you in the ash heap of your grief without flinching. To hear another voice say, "You are not alone. This is not weakness, this is sacred strength." And yet, how often do we rob ourselves of this healing because we are too afraid to be real? We fear judgment, we fear being misunderstood, we fear being too much. And so, instead of inviting others into our pain, we construct polished versions of ourselves to show the world, hoping someone will notice the cracks without us having to speak. But that strategy is exhausting. It is unsustainable, and worst of all, it is unnecessary. For the truth is, everyone is carrying something. Everyone knows the language of ache, and in that shared humanity, there is room for connection. Pain, when carried together, loses its power to isolate. It becomes bearable, sometimes even beautiful, not because it ceases to hurt, but because it becomes a point of contact, a bridge rather than a barrier. Yet we continue, generation after generation, to idolize independence. We praise the strong silent types, the ones who push through, who never let their guard down, who manage their suffering like a project rather than a story. But strength that requires you to be alone is not strength. It is self-preservation masquerading as courage. True courage is found in confession. True healing begins the moment you risk exposure. When you allow your pain to be seen, when you place it in the light, instead of keeping it hidden in the shadows of isolation, it begins to lose its venom. Not its presence, perhaps, but its power. For many, the idea of God remains safely tucked away in the realm of abstraction. He is spoken of in symbols, sung about in hymns, pondered in philosophy. He is referenced as a concept, debated as a theory, admired as a figure of moral authority. But for the person walking through real suffering, for the one who wakes up every day to the weight of grief, for the soul aching from betrayal, for the mind battered by anxiety, or the heart hollowed by loss, abstract notions offer little comfort. Platitudes about divine love do not dry tears in the silence of night. Poetic theology does not fill the void left by the absence of hope. When pain becomes real, we no longer want to hear about a God who is metaphorical or merely inspirational. We want to know if he's here, if he sees, if he acts, if he touches, if he moves, not just in history, but in our moment, in our mess, in our aching now. There is something profoundly intimate about the idea of God having hands. Not hands that are figurative, distant, or symbolic, but hands that actually reach into the soil of human suffering. Hands that do not recoil from our filth, that do not hesitate at the sight of our wounds. Hands that formed us, held us, and even now desire to heal us. The hands of God are not mere imagery for comfort. They are the means through which the eternal makes contact with the temporal, the infinite touching the fragile, the holy embracing the hurting. And yet, so many have been conditioned to think of God as an aloof force, a cosmic observer, a celestial being who remains untouched by human sorrow. But Scripture and the testimony of millions throughout history point to something far more intimate. A God who does not only send help, but who is help, who does not merely offer answers, but who becomes the answer through his nearness. To believe in the reality of God's hands is to acknowledge that healing is not a self-directed journey, but a divine encounter. We do not restore ourselves. We are not the architects of our own renewal. We do not crawl our way into wholeness through intellect or discipline alone. There is a point, often at the end of our efforts, where healing only begins when we let ourselves be held. And to be held by God is not wishful thinking. It is the very essence of grace. His hands are not hesitant. They do not fumble. They do not grow weary or lose patience. They are scarred, yes, scarred by love so fierce it bore the weight of the world's sin. But those scars are now the proof of our hope. They remind us that God does not heal from a distance. He heals from within the wound itself. Yet the tragedy is that many people continue to live as if these hands are unavailable to them, as if they're reserved only for the holy, the worthy, the strong. But God's hands are not withheld from the broken. They are drawn to them. A bruised reed he will not break. A smouldering wick he will not snuff out. His hands are gentle enough to cradle a shattered soul, and strong enough to lift the heaviest sorrow. And when we dare to open ourselves, not just in belief but in trust, we begin to experience what no doctrine can fully articulate: an actual encounter, a real presence, a touch that does not simply console, but begins to reassemble what has fallen apart. There is something uniquely human in the longing to be held, to be touched not out of demand, but out of compassion. And it is precisely this longing that God answers, not in principle, but in person. We may not always feel it immediately. The evidence of divine touch may not always come with dramatic signs or sudden relief. Sometimes it comes in the stillness, in the strength that returns just enough to take one more breath, one more step. Sometimes it comes through a whisper that quiets the chaos, or a moment of peace that passes understanding. But always, it is real, not theoretical, not metaphorical, real, tangible, present. The hands that shaped galaxies are the same hands extended now, not to scold, but to save. There is a paradox at the heart of healing that we are often too afraid to face. That true restoration begins not in strength, but in surrender. And yet surrender, though frequently spoken of in spiritual terms, remains one of the most resisted acts of the human soul. We crave healing. We pray for peace. We long for change, but we cling just as tightly to the very things that prevent it. Our pain becomes oddly familiar, our brokenness strangely comforting. We grip our hurt like a shield, convinced it protects us from further harm. when in reality it keeps us trapped inside the echo chamber of our own wounds. We want God to move, to intervene, to renew us, but without asking us to release our grip on control, pride, resentment, or the illusion of self-sufficiency. And in doing so, we unknowingly delay the healing we so desperately need. Holding on is not always about stubbornness. Often it's about fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of being vulnerable, fear of letting go of our identity as the wounded one, the wronged one, the one who was abandoned, rejected, misunderstood. We hold on because the pain has become part of our story, a chapter we don't know how to close without losing ourselves. We fear that surrender might minimize the depth of our suffering or erase the significance of our scars. But healing is not about erasing the past. It is about finally being free from its power to define and dominate the present. As long as we continue to clutch the past in clenched fists, there is no room for the future to take hold. We imagine healing to be an event, sudden, immediate, decisive. But often it is a process, and like all processes, it requires space. But when our hands are full of bitterness, full of self-justification, full of old narratives we refuse to challenge, there is no space for grace to land, no room for divine restoration to take root. We are asking for light while we keep the shutters closed. We are asking to be filled while staying sealed tight. The letting go is not a punishment, it is the precondition. Not because God demands a test of trust, but because healing cannot coexist with self-protection. The walls we build to guard our wounds also keep out the very love that can mend them. Letting go is not about forgetting what happened to you. It is not about pretending it didn't hurt, or pretending you are unaffected. It is about recognizing that you were never meant to carry it alone, and certainly not forever. There is a deep fatigue that settles in the soul when we carry what only God can bear. We try to manage our pain like a project, organizing it, analyzing it, keeping it within reach so we can control how it affects us. But in doing so, we trap ourselves inside it. The healing that God offers does not enter through domination, but invitation. He does not force his way in. He waits until we willingly release what we were never created to hold. The grip we have on our trauma, our pride, our unmet expectations, our grudges may feel like strength, but it is more often the evidence of our fear. And healing, by its very nature, requires trust. Not just trust that God is able, but that he is safe, that we can place our sorrow into his hands and it will not be mishandled, that we can let go of control and not be left to fall. Surrender is not weakness, it is wisdom. It is the humble acknowledgement that we do not have the capacity to both carry our wounds and be free from them at the same time. We must choose. We must decide whether we want to be right or healed, guarded or open, cautious or whole. And choosing healing will cost us something. It always does. It may cost the version of ourselves we have learned to survive with. It may cost the narratives we've repeated to justify staying stuck. It may cost our pride, our comfort, our carefully constructed independence, but what we receive in return cannot be bought, borrowed, or built with human effort. It is peace. It is freedom. It is the slow but steady repair of a soul that is no longer its own physician. Surrender is a word that rarely receives admiration in a world that glorifies control. We are taught from a young age to take charge, to set goals, to master outcomes, to fight for what we want and hold fast to what is ours. Surrender, by contrast, sounds like defeat. It seems to belong to the vocabulary of weakness, to those who have run out of options, to those too exhausted or broken to keep trying. And yet, in the mysterious and often upside-down order of the spiritual life, surrender is not the end of strength, but its beginning. It is not the giving up of hope, but the opening of the soul to a greater hope than it could generate on its own. Surrender is not about resignation. It is about realignment. It is the conscious decision to stop resisting the flow of grace, to stop clinging to illusions of control, and to place our deepest wounds and wildest fears in the hands of the one who knows how to hold them. What makes surrender so difficult is not the act itself, but what it requires of us. It demands honesty, an unfiltered admission that we are not sufficient, not in control, not able to mend what is broken by sheer willpower. This honesty terrifies us because it strips us bare. It removes the armor we have carefully built to present ourselves as strong, competent, unfazed. And yet, it is precisely in that naked honesty that healing begins to move. Because surrender, real surrender, is not passive. It is deeply active. It is a defiant act against the tyranny of fear. It is the courageous choice to say, I cannot carry this anymore. I cannot fix this. But I believe there is one who can. In that moment, we lay down our weapons, not because the battle is over, but because we finally realize we are not the ones meant to fight it alone. There is hidden power in surrender because it draws us out of isolation and back into the arms of the divine. We stop trying to engineer outcomes. We stop measuring our worth by our ability to hold it all together. We stop striving to manage life in a way that avoids pain at all costs. And instead, we begin to experience a peace that no achievement could purchase, a strength that comes not from our efforts, but from our openness. We begin to see that surrender is not the absence of action, but the redirection of trust from ourselves to the one who made us. To surrender is to stop asking, how can I make this better, and start asking, what is God doing in this? It is to yield, not in hopelessness, but in confidence that our story is not over, and that our brokenness is not beyond repair. Most of us want God to intervene, to act on our behalf, to bring comfort and resolution, but we rarely want to let go of our own grip long enough for Him to take hold. We say, God, take this, while still keeping one hand on the steering wheel. But healing doesn't happen that way. True transformation comes when we release our version of the plan and dare to trust in His. Surrender becomes a holy posture, hands open, heart exposed, expectations laid down. The irony is that what feels like loss becomes the pathway to gain. We think we are giving up control, but what we are really surrendering is the burden of pretending to be in control. We think we are stepping into uncertainty, but we are actually stepping into the only certainty worth trusting, the unchanging nature of a God who sees, who knows, and who works all things together for good. The very act of letting go becomes the doorway through which strength enters, a different kind of strength, one that is not born from effort but from rest, not from assertion but from abiding. And as we begin to live in that space, not striving, not resisting, but simply trusting, we discover that surrender was never about giving up. It was about giving in, to grace, to love, to the gentle hands of the one who is not just able to heal, but deeply desires to. Healing is often misunderstood. Many believe it begins with strength, with resolve, with some kind of bold declaration that we are ready to overcome. But healing, true soul-deep healing, rarely begins with grandeur. It begins at the quiet, uncomfortable intersection of two forces the world rarely holds together: faith and honesty. Faith alone, if unaccompanied by truthfulness, can become hollow optimism, a refusal to confront the real condition of the heart. Honesty without faith, on the other hand, can become despair, a cold and brutal acceptance that things are broken with no hope of restoration. But when these two meet, when a person dares to speak the truth of their pain while still holding on to a fragile belief that God can meet them there, something sacred happens. A door opens, a flicker of light breaks into the darkness, and the healing begins. There is a tendency in religious and spiritual circles to rush past the honesty part. We're told to have faith, to trust God, to speak life, and all of these are beautiful, powerful truths in the right context. But sometimes these phrases become tools of denial, subtle ways of saying, don't talk about the pain, just believe. And so we end up hiding, editing ourselves for fear of sounding faithless. We silence our grief, minimize our trauma, pretend we're fine when we are anything but. But God is not asking us to pretend. He is not intimidated by our honesty. In fact, He welcomes it. He is not looking for polished words or spiritual performance. He is looking for the broken-hearted to come as they are. Honesty is not the enemy of faith. It is its foundation. Without honesty, faith is nothing more than positive thinking dressed in religious language. But when we bring our truth, raw, unfiltered, imperfect, and lay it before God, faith becomes real. It becomes costly. It becomes transformative. And honesty, real honesty, is more than admitting we're hurt. It's admitting what the pain has done to us. It's confessing the bitterness we carry, the questions we've buried, the parts of ourselves we don't want anyone to see. It's standing in front of God, not as the version of ourselves we think He wants, but as we actually are. Not with the correct answers, but with the honest questions. Where were you, God? Why did you allow this? Do you still care? These questions are not irreverent. They are sacred. They are the cries of a soul refusing to settle for empty comfort. And it is precisely in those moments, when we bring both our pain and our trembling belief, that healing takes root. Faith, then, is not the absence of doubt. It is not the ability to recite Scripture without flinching or to pray with perfect eloquence. Faith is the courage to keep showing up, to keep placing our broken pieces into the hands of a God we cannot always feel, to believe in the goodness of a Father even when the evidence around us says otherwise. It is the trust that even in the silence, God is listening, that even in the waiting, He is working, that even when everything in us wants to withdraw, to self-protect, to retreat into numbness or control, there is a better way, a braver way. Healing begins when we stop hiding, from others, from God, from ourselves. When we take off the mask, not only in the presence of people, but in prayer. When we dare to say, God, this is what's really going on inside me, and I need you. That moment, more than the perfect prayer, more than the well-rehearsed faith declaration, is where grace rushes in. Not because we finally got it right, but because we finally got real. It is in the mess, in the contradictions, in the tangle of belief and doubt, that God moves most powerfully. And in that space, where honesty meets hope, where brokenness meets belief, the impossible begins to happen. What we thought was unhealable begins to mend. What we assumed was too far gone starts to breathe again. The crossroads of faith and honesty is not a place of weakness. It is the sacred threshold where God's power begins to restore what we thought would never be whole again.